Right. Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are really excited to have with us David and Margaret Talbot, who are the authors of this wonderful book, which I will be telling you about shortly, By the Light of the Burning Dreams, the Triumphs and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution. So that will be the feature of our interview today. And for those of you who are local, Reader's Books in Sonoma has it in stock. You can get it today. So I'm sure you'll want to after you hear this interview. As many of you know, David Talbot has spoken at other Praxis events. He's a journalist, author, and media executive, and he was the founder and editor-in-chief of the early web magazine Salon. He's also the author of The Devil's Chessboard, Season of the Witch, Brothers, Between Heaven and Hell, and his latest with his sister Margaret, By the Light of Burning Dreams. And Margaret Talbot is the writer for New Yorker magazine, and author of The Entertainer, which is about their father, Lyle Talbot, about the Hollywood of that era. She's also written for Atlantic Monthly, The New Republic, New York Times Magazine, and other publications. So welcome, David and Margaret. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to start with where the book started. There are 6 different movements to the book. I look at it as like a symphony with 6 movements. And the first movement, it goes through the movements that were really started in the 60s, the 1960s, and then mushroomed beyond. And the first one begins with the New Left and Tom Hayden. So I want to ask about that. I thought there were some very interesting things that you brought out about his involvement and really how he spearheaded the New Left movement of the 60s through SDS and the Port Huron Statement. So I would like you to comment on some of the accomplishments of Tom Hayden that really has had very little press at all over the years, because he actually did achieve a lot in his lifetime, both kind of in and outside the system. And I would like you to talk about some of those accomplishments that you think have not received their proper due. And of course, you can mention the flaws personally as well.
Of course. And I know you knew him as well, Georgia, and he spoke, I think.
Many of our events.
Yeah. Well, I knew Tom. I wasn't close friends with Tom, but I knew him over the years. And I think of him as one of the great figures of the New Left. He was, as we write in the book, the Thomas Jefferson, in some ways, in the good sense, not the bad sense, of the movement. He was a great writer. He wrote, of course, the first draft, largely, of the Port Huron Statement, which was the manifesto of the New Left. It became the guiding sort of document behind the New Left and the radical student movement, SDS, and so on in the 1960s. Tom was a visionary. He was a great writer. He was a great organizer. And many of the upheavals of the 60s, from the freedom rides in the South during the early 60s, mid 60s, to register Black voters, the anti-war movement, and so on. Tom was a part of that. He was in Newark before the uprising in Newark in 1966, I believe. He was trying to bring together the civil rights movement and the peace movement. He was one of the Chicago 8, of course, put on trial for conspiring to disrupt the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. Tom was everywhere. And he then, I think, and what our book does is to focus on inflection points, turning points in the lives of these various radical leaders in the 60s and 70s that not only changed deeply the lives of the people that we're profiling, but also the course of American history, for good and ill in some cases. But Tom was visionary. He realized as the Vietnam War was ending that the New Left had to pivot. And pivot in his case meant going into electoral politics. He decided, and it was a very epic decision that he made in 1975 to contest the US Senate seat held by a Democrat, kind of a lightweight corporate Democrat named John Tunney in California. And that, I think, campaign that he ran on the platform of economic democracy, because at that point in the Cold War, you couldn't call it what Bernie Sanders later called it, socialism. But he was years ahead of Bernie Sanders, years ahead of AOC and other progressive Democrats who've gone into the electoral arena now. And unfortunately, not enough people on the left learned or from his experience or were inspired by it. But to Tom's great credit, no matter what his personal flaws were, and we can talk about that more later, he stuck with it. And he put together a career as a state legislator in California under mostly Republican governors, by the way. So he was always fighting an uphill battle for progressive legislation. But I have great, respect for what Tom Hayden did. He helped end the war in Vietnam. There's no doubt about that. By leading an organization called the Indochina Peace Campaign, he and Jane Fonda, they eventually cut off congressional funding for the war in 1975, which led to a North Vietnamese victory there. So, I think finally Tom is getting his due. Adam Gopnik, I know in his new book, which is a cultural history of the 60s and the Cold War period, devotes, I think, most of a chapter to Tom Hayden. And
That's Louis Menand, actually, just
I'm sorry, Louis,
fact check.
thank you. Also from the New Yorker.
Also from the New Yorker, exactly.
In any case, Tom, I think, is finally getting the due he deserves, and I'm glad to see it.
Great. Yeah, he was one of the very interesting leftist politicians, partially because he had worked so far outside of the system so long, and also then decided to work inside the system and do something that a lot of people on the left were unable to do, which is actually run for office and accept power. And he did talk about the reluctance of the left to take power, which I thought was also very interesting. I have another couple of questions on that, but I want to move along. So I want to get to the Black Panthers, which was the next part of the book, which I thought was very interesting, because they also were a group that never got their due with what they accomplished. I mean, what they didn't accomplish well, they got plenty of press about, but not what they did. And I think you highlighted Bobby Seale's role in the Black Panthers, which I think was critical. And though you mentioned and talk about the other leaders in it, I think his role is something that people don't know a lot about. And it would be really nice for you to tell us more about Bobby Seale and what he accomplished.
Yeah, I think, that triumvirate that we know that were the three very charismatic men who were known as the leaders of the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, and Eldridge Cleaver. Bobby was the great visionary, was grounded, I think, in political reality. And he had his hands full, frankly, trying to restrain often his good friend, Huey Newton, and Eldridge Cleaver, who emerged from prison with Soul on Ice as a very charismatic literary figure and a revolutionary. And both of those men, Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton, were very hard to control. But it was Bobby who had, I think, the realistic sense of how you make change in America, radical change. And, in contrast to the kind of militant sort of anti-civil rights attitude that many people thought the Black Panthers had, Bobby had great respect for Martin Luther King. And as we write in the book, Bobby told me this, that King reached out to him and said, would you join with the Black Panthers, join my march on Washington, the Poor People's March, which would have been, I think, an amazing event had Martin not been assassinated, of course, in April of 1968. Because he was trying to bring together, and Margaret and I really stress this a lot in the book, that a lot of the 60s, the success of the 60s was because of coalition building between these various groups and these various leaders. And as I say, Martin reached out to the farm workers, he reached out to the Panthers and said, join my march on Washington. It was not going to be just a march, by the way, it's going to be an occupation of Washington, a very radical thing, and to force Congress to divert spending from the Vietnam War to domestic issues. So, this was, I think, one of the great, aims of the 60s was to bring together all these different strands of protest in one great movement. And we failed to do that, sadly, but the vision was there. Bobby Seale shared in that vision. He shared the Tom Hayden vision of wanting to go into electoral politics. And he finally ran himself for mayor of Oakland in 1973. He lost, but he ran a good, strong campaign. And I think if the Panthers had survived beyond that and into the 70s and 80s, they would have become a very effective political machine in cities like Oakland. So I credit Bobby with a lot of vision, courage, certainly. They confronted cops on the streets of Oakland, violent, racist cops with guns in a lawful manner, in a restrained way, but they did it and they risked their own lives doing that. And then, as I say, Bobby wanted to lead the group more in electoral strategy after that. The repression, the violence directed against the Panthers by the FBI, by the government, by police agencies was unrelenting. And I think that, along with the demons, frankly, of people like Huey Newton, tore apart the Panther organization finally. But it wasn't through, I think, any limitations of Bobby Seale. He remains, I think, the great leader of that period.
Yeah, that was a really good point I think you made in the book too. I want to move on now to the third chapter, which was about feminism and the rise of feminism in the 60s. And there were many things in that chapter that I had not known about. And one is, I never knew the role of Casey Hayden, who was Tom Hayden's first wife, and how pivotal she was in the feminist movement. In fact, one of the archetypes, architects of the movement, as you said, Margaret. So, and the Jane movement, I had never heard about. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what the movement, the Jane movement was, some of Casey's work, and what is meant by, quote, radical feminism.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up Casey Hayden. She's a really dynamic and interesting character. And a lot of the founders of the women's movement, women's liberation in the 60s were people who had come out of the civil rights movement, including one of the main characters in the chapter, Heather Booth, people who had gone south during Freedom Summer and had participated as volunteers in those voter registration drives. And for a lot of the white women who were young, who were college age, for the most part, it was a real, it was an eye opener on many levels, and relevant to this chapter, it was an eye opener because there were a lot of Black women leaders in the civil rights movement, and particularly in and around SNCC. So people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and some of the younger SNCC women were very inspirational, just in being out front and center the way they were as political organizers. So a lot of those women, like Casey Hayden, like Heather Booth, kind of cut their teeth as organizers in the movement and were really inspired by the role of Black women in the movement. And then as they came back and got involved in the New Left and SDS and other organizations, they were both very inspired by the kind of message of, we're going to transform the world, we're going to transform personal relations, we're going to bring meaning into people's lives, as well as economic equity and racial equity and so on. But they were also very frustrated when some of that didn't seem to apply to them, because they were treated sometimes with condescension or worse. I mean, there are a couple of stories about, feminists who gave speeches like Marilyn Webb at a famous anti-war rally in 1969 in DC, and was, shouted off the stage, by guys saying, drag her off the stage and fuck her, excuse my language. So, there was a lot of frustration with that kind of thing, and just with feeling that their issues weren't being heard. So that was really a forcing ground for feminism, the idea that we're part of this movement whose ideals we really believe in, and which seem so liberating, but they aren't necessarily liberating us. So, the connection with the Jane group, which this chapter really focuses on, is this woman Heather Booth, who is a remarkable progressive organizer, and who, as a student at the University of Chicago, having come back from Freedom Summer, got a call from a friend whose sister needed an abortion. Of course, abortion was illegal. It was 1965. And she tried to figure out a way to help her, and ended up starting this referral service, originally just referring women, although even that was, of course, very risky, to get abortions from doctors who were willing to provide it. But the women often had to be blindfolded, so they wouldn't know where they were going, and they wouldn't be able to identify the doctor, and so on. And eventually, as she became more involved in feminism, she started being frustrated that it had to be handled this way, in this kind of shame-inducing and often very frightening way. And so eventually, the women started providing the abortions themselves. And eventually the women trained themselves to actually do the abortions themselves. And remarkably, they did about 10,000 abortions in the end, really primarily for poor people and a lot of women of color, because by the end of the time that they were doing their work, abortion was legal in a few states, and women who had the means could go to those other states like New York and get an abortion. But they provided 10,000 abortions with a really remarkable safety record. And they kind of, in a way, with like the Black Panthers providing the healthcare that they did, the medical clinics and the free breakfast program and so on, they were creating these vibrant alternative institutions, which showed a different way of doing things and also provided direct aid to people.
Yeah, this is very good. Very interesting too, to read about all this. I guess now I'm going to Arthur because I wanted to talk about Cesar Chavez next, which is the next part of the book. You called that title The Martyr Complex, which I thought was very interesting for a variety of reasons. One is there is that sense of martyrdom in the roles that Cesar Chavez particularly took in the fasts but some of the different strategies, like again, the coalition building with the Filipino grape workers was very important in their effect. But also the boycotts, which I thought were extraordinary in that time. And I would like you to talk about the coalition building that they did, the boycotts, and what you think was the most effective strategy that they practiced that worked for them.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Well, what's interesting about, the organization that Chavez put together was really extraordinary. I mean, it was based on sort of a model partly that he had learned in the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was Saul Alinsky's group, which he had joined in the 50s, which also involved building coalitions with, religious groups, community groups. And then, but it just, the chapter focuses on Chavez's first big hunger strike in 1968, which sort of coincided with a decision by Chavez, which was somewhat controversial and in some ways, had some negative effects down the line. But that was to take the struggle of the farm workers who were fighting this incredibly difficult battle of going on strikes, fighting against individual growers and the growers associations for different crops in the Central Valley of California and over by Salinas. And they decided to go national and appeal really to the conscience of the whole country through this boycott against grapes and later against lettuce in another campaign. And what that did was already his organization had brought in, religious leaders, religious lay leaders, lay activists and students. Everybody you can think of from a lot of different walks of life had come down to Delano originally, which was where in California where they were organizing and based initially in the grape strikes. And then, but through the boycott, it just expanded their outreach, across the country and gave so many people, thousands and thousands of people in the United States, this feeling of belonging to this struggle for these people who really had nothing and had very little power. And it was a brilliant move because as has been shown, time and time again in agricultural organizing, it's a sucker's battle. I mean, it's just really hard you have so many different things operating against you. It's easy for growers to just, pick up and go away for a while, or to hire really hungry immigrants who come in and don't even know what's going on as they're becoming, scabs, and there's violence and there's just the extreme poverty and instability of the people you're working with in a lot of these areas makes it very difficult to organize. And then there's mechanization over the long term also has affected, the ability of these people of the farm workers to organize. So, I think this idea of getting the whole country, the whole sort of liberal conscience of the whole country involved was really a brilliant move, and it was effective. It got them, in the short term at least, it got many of the growers to concede to higher wages and better conditions.
Yes, I remember that well. I remember giving out flyers at grocery stores, Safeways, to people coming in to shop, telling them not to buy grapes. And I
Right.
think that boycott was incredibly successful because, I mean, I didn't get to eat grapes for 18 years, I think, because first there was that boycott, then there was the second one because of the pesticides use on the farm workers.
Right.
So, and I'm a person who eats grapes every day.
Right.
So
You
this
had to
was-
keep
talk about
close
a barter
watch on.
complex.
Yeah. Right.
So,
Yeah.
now there are 3 more parts of the book, and I know we can't get to them in my question period, but I just want to mention them for everybody else, because I think they were really important. The LGBT community that managed to really change the social understanding of being gay and being accepted for being gay in a very short period of time. The Yippies, which I think one of you wrote was, it's probably David, combining Marx with the Marx Brothers, which I thought was very interesting. Well, I'm not sure that their role was helpful or disruptive. I'd be curious to know what any of you think about that.
Well, I mentioned the Yippies. We discussed the Yippies in the context of writing about John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Right.
And John, of course, when he came to the US, fell under the sway originally largely of Jerry Rubin and Stu Albert of the Yippies, and to a lesser extent, Abby Hoffman. They were artists, performance artists. The Beatles, John Lennon, Yoko Ono was an artist, a performance artist herself. And so she, and they both, John and Yoko, kind of were dazzled by the Yippies' display of irreverence and the humor they brought to an otherwise pretty humorless anti-war movement.
Mhm.
So I credit, the Yippies with their understanding of how to cut through sort of the media barrage in America and captivate people. But I think the Yippies were of limited use politically in the long run. And I think John recognized that as well. But that chapter is really more about the sort of politics of celebrity and the extent to which you can use your power as a well-known entertainer to, both focus people on causes, on issues, and to raise money, frankly. And John Lennon was able to do that brilliantly. And he did it with Yoko Ono. They were very much in tandem. They were a team. And often it was Yoko's political vision and her artistic vision that had an impact on Lennon. He says he credits her, for instance, with the song Imagine, which came out of her way of thinking, out of the book, her earlier book, Grapefruit. Be daring enough to imagine a different world originally came from Yoko's inspiration. So I think that year of living dangerously, as we write, when John and Yoko were living down Greenwich Village in a very funky apartment next to their good friends, Merce Cunningham and John Cage, the artist who Yoko knew from an earlier period in New York, was a very important period to look at because they were going up against the Nixon administration, and they were trying to topple a sitting president and stop a war, and nothing less than that. And they came under, again, like the Panthers, like Tom Hayden, under amazing surveillance and political repression as a result. J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, Attorney General John Mitchell took John Lennon very seriously, an ex-Beatle, challenging them. And they thought, because that was the original intention, for John to go across the country in 1972, giving concerts and organizing young people and getting them to vote. And this was the first year that the 18-year-old vote was going to come into being. And so Nixon was deathly afraid that John Lennon would catalyze this youth vote against him. And of course, that was the goal. And so I think this year of living dangerously for the ex-Beatle John Lennon and for Yoko Ono, his essential partner, is fascinating. And most people don't know how radical John was becoming.
Right.
You know, going up to Harlem with the Panthers to perform a concert on behalf of the Attica families, families who lost loved ones in that terrible massacre at Attica State Prison. You know, John performed a benefit at the Apollo Theater in Harlem on behalf of those families. And again, he was doing things like that, putting his body and himself on the line with Yoko. So, you know, I have great respect for what they were trying to do. And yes, the hippies, you know, he was momentarily dazzled by them, but I think John went beyond the hippies.
Yeah, I think so too. And I know I want to get into it, but I think maybe people can ask about it, the plight of the Native Americans today and the history and what all that has been about too. But I wanted to get to something you just touched on now, and that is the FBI, CIA, COINTELPRO, and how they disrupted organizations, created internal factionalism, sowed a lot of suspicion within the movements. And I think this is still going on. And I really believe that the left needs to understand this disruptive strategy in order to withstand today in our movements and to combat it. When we come across infiltrators and agent provocateurs and people that are really trying to come in and disrupt organizations. Do you have some comments, any of you, on that?
Well, I think we can all comment on that. Do you want to go first, Margaret? Or Art?
Well, you go first and I'll come in after.
All right, well, let's just talk about our last chapter, which is on the American Indian movement and their occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. From that point on, but even earlier, AIM was infiltrated by ultimately thousands of police agents, provocateurs, spies, and so on. And the purpose of that infiltration, largely carried out by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover and his successors, was to disrupt and to tear apart the organization. And they were very successful at doing this. And they did it by creating paranoia and dissension within the organization, getting people to all suspect one another. You know, at one point, Dennis Banks, who I interviewed before he died, the leader of the American Indian movement, along with Russell Means, his bodyguard, who followed him everywhere, who flew him places, was an agent, was a police agent. His ex-wife, Kamuk, was a police informer. So imagine being surrounded that intimately by people who were spying on you, and what that would do to your head. At one point, finally, tragically, a woman who was an activist within the American Indian movement, Anime Akwash, was suspected of being an informer and was executed, basically, shot in the head and left for dead by the side of a road in a reservation. And this kind of thing haunted Dennis Banks for years later. It was unclear who ordered the execution. No top people were ever brought to trial for it within AIM. But this was the kind of paranoia that resulted sometimes in violence. In other case of Black Panthers, Alex Rackley, a young member of the Panthers in New Haven, Connecticut, was tortured and murdered by a guy in the Panthers who Bobby Seale thought he had kicked out of the Panthers, and turned out to be an FBI agent. So the FBI was torturing and murdering someone. And of course, we know what the FBI, along with police agents in Chicago, did to a sleeping Fred Hampton, the young charismatic leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, who was murdered in his sleep at the age of 21. So this is how dangerous it was to be a dissenter in this period. And the COINTEL program, the counterintelligence program launched by Hoover in the 60s, and targeting these various groups, anyone who spoke out, any organization, women's liberation groups, the Panthers, anti-war leaders, was virulent, unlawful, and often violent.
Yeah, and I would just add that I was actually surprised to learn that Hoover, through COINTELPRO, also targeted the women's liberation movement. I had not read as much about that, and I don't think it was his top priority, but it was one of his priorities. So I also say there's just been a lot of great research and scholarship on this subject in the last few years. There's a great book by Betty Metzger about the group of people who actually stole liberated some of the COINTELPRO files. And I'm sorry, I maybe somebody can look up the name while we're on here of the book, but tells that story. And so much was revealed in those files that they stole. It was a group of Quaker activists in Pennsylvania, I believe. You know, a lot of the files revealed, for example, Hoover's particular obsession with MLK and with other leaders of the civil rights movement. So it's good that some of that has been coming to light with some really good scholarship and reporting and research in recent years.
Yes, I think we're probably still going to be dealing with it. Maybe they'll call them something else at this point in time because so much has been revealed about their tactics. But I think we still have to be careful going forward, and especially in groups that are being successful, that they will be infiltrated. There will be agent provocateurs. There will be people sowing discord. So I think that's something all of us on the left need to be cognizant of and aware of.
But you know, can I add something to that?
Sure.
I think it's important because it's a very important point. Unfortunately, the lesson that a lot of younger activists have taken from that is that leaders themselves are victims, are targets, and can't be, the whole notion of leadership should not be trusted, and we can't invest in leaders. I don't think that's the correct lesson. I think movements to be successful over time need good leadership. It has to be accountable. It has to be democratic. It has to be transparent, but we need that kind of strong, visionary, and courageous leadership. I think the lesson to take from the 60s and 70s is we need to do a much better job of protecting these leaders. You know, when I went to Standing Rock, basically that occupation, no guns, explicitly peaceful, very spiritual, and in my experience, run by women. And a very different vibe than earlier sort of actions in the 1960s, and but very, very disciplined. And as a white guy going into Standing Rock, I was immediately came under suspicion. People wanted to know who I was. I was questioned. I had to go through a kind of a vetting by people at a media tent. Obviously I showed my credentials and people recognized who I was finally, but there was a strong discipline, internal discipline within that camp, and a strong sense of security. And they had to have that because they were under constant pressure from a very militarized police force surrounding Standing Rock on the reservation there. So I think we need a sense of discipline that we don't have at this point, really, in every organization.
I think that's a really good point, David. I'm going to open this up now for questions from our audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you can put your hand up automatically. It's usually an easier way for us to see you. Everyone is just bowled over so far. We can always go on with, I mean, there's so many things I wasn't able to cover just in the amount of time, but any questions?
I have one, Georgia.
Go ahead.
I would like to know if the book addresses the underlying current of racism that has clouded our entire history.
Well, yes.
I hope so.
Yeah, the book, I think, in many chapters, if not every chapter, deals with that issue. And in fact, we say that the treatment of African Americans in particular, but all people of color in this country, is a barometer of how successful or not successful the American enterprise has been over the years. And of course, I think in those moments when you see a resurgent Black Power movement, when you see a resurgent American Indian movement, or as Art was talking about, Mexican American farm workers, then that's the better angels of America always. And they always push America in the right direction towards more civil rights, towards more freedom, towards more equality, towards more social justice. So I think in many ways, America at its best has been led by people of color fighting for their rights, and white radicals, white progressives joining with them, because they realize that's the kind of country we all want to live in.
Yes.
Okay, next. We'll go back to my questions if we don't find any questions from people.
Sure.
Um,
Georgia,
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question. You know, I'm so intrigued by having both David and Margaret here. And I think of the 60s, and I think of how women were just beginning to expound on their rights and coming of age and whatever. In the collaboration, you know, that the two of you have, did you not exploit, but did you explore, okay, that particular voice? Because I'm very intrigued, especially with giving, you know, David's last sighting of women controlling the other demonstrated area, you know, so maybe you might expand on that
Yeah.
a bit.
I mean, I think again, it's kind of like the theme of race, the themes of women and kind of reimagining personal life, and there's a chapter on yeah, the LGBTQ movement. So it's definitely present, that theme. But just personally, I would say, you know, David, and I don't mean to out him by age here, but he's 8 years older than I am. And so, you know, as you get older, that age difference makes kind of no difference. But when you're younger, it's kind of important. So, you know, when I was 12 or so, he was in college, he was at Santa Cruz, and he was a radical activist, and I was, you know, a kid. And I visited the collective, the sort of feminist collective, kind of lesbian feminist collective that somehow David lived in. I'm not really sure exactly how he got special dispensation to
Whole
live
other
there.
book. That's a whole other book.
That's a whole other book, but he did, and my sister lived there as well. And my sister was actually very involved in, our sister was very involved in the, you know, women's health movement and women's liberation movements, and went on to become a doctor, but, you know, brought a lot of that understanding of being more sort of empowering to patients, all patients, but especially women, into her medical practice. But I, you know, all that to say that I was very influenced as a kid, and also felt a little bit frustrated that I could not be there for the, you know, heat of the moment, so to speak, with the social justice movements of the 60s and 70s. It got a little bit more of the tail end of it, you know, the fumes. But this was a great opportunity to kind of go back to it and go more deeply into it, and great to be able to do it with David and with, you know, special guest star, my husband, Art Allen, on the Cesar Chavez chapter. So it was a really fun thing to be, a fun project, you know, as serious as some of the issues are, and as sobering, it was also really exhilarating and inspiring and fun to work on. And I hope the book is too. I think it is. I think
The book is fabulous.
Thank you. And I hope it will be inspiring to movements today, you know, of younger.
George, can I just add
Sure.
that how great it was to be able to work with Margaret and with Art, because I couldn't have done this book without them. Their collaboration was essential. You know, I had a stroke back in 2017, some of you know, just as I was prepared to begin writing the book. And so I turned to Margaret and Art at that point and said, will you help me? And they could have said, sorry, pal, you're on your own. But there's no two journalists I respect more than Art and Margaret. And they were, God bless them, willing to jump in and write part of the book. And I think it's much better because of that. And frankly, it's much better because of the delay. I think now it speaks to a new generation of activists post George Floyd and all the events of the last year than it would have before. I think the lessons that these people have to teach us and the inspiration, as Margaret said, are crucial for the movements of activists today. And, you know, frankly, after doing one book after the next about power and the dark side of power in America, I really enjoy doing a book about people who were trying to move the country in the right direction. In a way, it was more like a national version of my book, Season of the Witch, in which I told the story of how we liberated San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s, the gay rights movement, the hippie movement, and so on. And, you know, these were people who had a similar vision, a vision of equality and justice, and we're trying to, I think, take the country in a much better direction. You know, Robert Stone, the novelist, said in his memoir before he died that the only thing he regretted, and of course he was part of this history himself as one of the merry pranksters and so on. He wrote one of the great novels, I think, of the period, Dog Soldiers, about the impact, the psychic impact of Vietnam on the US. And Robert Stone wrote in his final memoir that the only thing he regretted was that we didn't win. We did win, I think, culturally and socially in many ways. The country is vastly different because of the 60s and 70s and these movements and Art and I write about. But we didn't win politically. We have to admit that. So, you know, that is the next goal.
Well, you know, that's what Tom Hayden used to say. In fact, he said it many times, that ever since the 60s, we've been living with a backlash to the 60s politically. So that's something we are still working on, overcoming that backlash. I think we're well on our way at this point, but that's, I've never forgotten him saying that. I think Brian wants to ask a question.
David, thanks for being here. If you would comment on this, you did just briefly, but Tom Hayden, Bobby Seale, Cesar Chavez, John Lennon, Heather Booth, all had something in common, and it can't be talked about enough. And that was J. Edgar Hoover and the incredible damage that Hoover did to all those people, and to many more, to Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. We'll talk more about that if you would.
Well, I think the repression is part of that story, and you know, we can't. It's a common thread throughout the book. You know, Cesar Chavez had to change houses every night to avoid being assassinated because of death threats he was receiving. Dolores Huerta told me that. You know, as I said earlier, people were being assassinated right and left during the 60s. Assassination was an important political tool. Jailing, harassment of these people on phony charges. Chicago 8 was a show trial, an attempt to decapitate the entire leadership of the protest movement in this country. And several of those defendants, by the way, had never even met each other, didn't even know each other. So the notion that they were conspiring somehow together is absurd. Am I still with you? Yeah, I guess.
Yes.
So. In any case, so the repression was systematic. It was often violent, as I said earlier. It was an attempt to turn different groups within these movements against each other, which they succeeded in doing. They got the Panthers in a war with another group, a Black nationalist group in LA. I interviewed that guy, by the way, Ron Karenga, when I was young.
When you were in high school, you interviewed
When
him.
I was in high school.
Yeah.
And by the way, Margaret, I'm 10 years older than you.
Let's set the record straight here.
I just shaved, you know, our dad was an actor. He shaved a couple of years off his age. I'm just doing the same for you.
Yeah. Thank you, darling. But I am 10 years older. And I see it every day of it.
Shocking.
In any case, the repression was severe, was systematic. They did turn groups against each other. There's a murderous shootout on the campus of UCLA between Karenga's group, us, and the Black Panthers. 2 people were killed, 2 Black Panthers. And the FBI was inciting that violence. So, you know, it's not something we want to dwell on just for its own sake. But I think that anytime a protest movement in this country threatens power, we're going to be seeing this again. And we don't have J. Edgar Hoover, but we still have police agencies and governments, unfortunately, that want to squelch dissent.
Right. And I think, at some other time, this won't be the time to do it, but at some time, David, I'd love to have a program with you where we just talk about the assassinations of the 60s and what we've learned about them and what we can learn going forward, because this has never been exposed, really admitted publicly. We all know, but it's not ever been acknowledged publicly. And I want to see that in my lifetime. So Ken Burrows, you have a question?
I do. David, nice to see you again. Margaret, nice to meet briefly. I'm wondering, given this second revolution, as you've named it, I'm thinking of feminism among the other movements that were initiated in the start of this second revolution. Where do we find ourselves now? I mean, what's the developmental edge as you see it? Where is activism these days? And if we look at feminism, there's a series of waves that are acknowledged, 3 or 4, depending on who you read. And I'm guessing it's similar in all of these movements. But what are your thoughts about where has the revolution taken us, and what are the developmental edges for activists right now?
Well, I will just say about feminism that, obviously feminism was so transformative, and we all live, very different, or many of us, perhaps most of us, live very different lives with many more possibilities than many women did in the 1950s and early 1960s. There are well, I'll just say that it astonishes me that in some ways, one of the focuses of this chapter, which is reproductive rights, access to contraception and abortion, are still such contested matters. And in fact, in some ways, more than they have been in a decade or more now, as we face a Supreme Court term with a very conservative, very anti-abortion Supreme Court that's going to be taking up this Mississippi, very restrictive Mississippi law. And perhaps, the fear that's been invoked for so long is actually quite legitimate now about overturning Roe v. Wade. So I think there are actually a lot of organizations that are doing things kind of like Jane was doing, making available medical abortion options to women to administer themselves, and doing kind of mutual aid approaches and so on. And so that's one area that's a kind of cutting edge or a kind of leading edge, I think you said, part of the feminist movement. I do feel that the reinvigoration of dialogue around race and Black Lives Matter in the last year or two, certainly since the murder of George Floyd, has been very activating and kind of exciting, and I'm hopeful about it, even though it's received a lot of pushback and backlash. Yeah, I mean, I personally feel like just holding on to our democracy through trying to turn back the repression of voting rights that the Republicans are seemingly so determined to carry out is a vital part of the progressive movement's agenda, should be and is. David, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think maybe my view is a bit darker. I think the radical energy in this country right now, the real passion, is on the right, the far right. And it's with the Republican Party as under Donald Trump, still under the sway of Donald Trump, as a key sort of battering ram and ally of that movement. I mean, the inability of Congress to launch an independent investigation of January 6th, an assault, a violent assault on the Capitol in which people died, that I think is deeply troubling.
Yes.
That Congress could not even investigate an attack on Congress. So the real passion in this country right now, the burning dreams, to quote our title of our book, is on the right, is on the far right. And I think we progressive people, and I think we're in the majority, which was indicated by the last presidential election, a narrow majority, by the way, and that was dismaying in itself. 74 million Americans after 4 years of Donald Trump voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And he didn't win, but despite what he thinks, but he came close. Dangerously close. Imagine another 4 years of this monster as
Could have been the end of our democracy.
it could be the end. So look, I think right now what we need to see is a sense of the fierce urgency of now. And our book, I hope, in its small way, incites people to take become more militant, frankly, more passionate as the people who are trying to steal democracy.
I think that's one thing your book does really successfully, is show us ways we can actually do that now by showing us the ones that worked, how they worked. And I think that is one of the most exciting things about your book, is that push toward recapturing what worked that we did and to take it further, because now we have to take it further because of the backlash. So, but we have people in power who support us now. We have Bernie Sanders.
By the way, Georgia, that and another thing that's both inspiring and dismaying is if you read the 10-point Black Panther Party platform that they wrote back in 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, over 50 years ago. You know, when I was at the 50th anniversary celebration of the Panthers at the Oakland Museum back in back in 2016, it was one of the professors there, a young woman at Merritt, where the Panthers started college, said that one of the depressing things to her was that young African-American students of hers wanted to look like the Panthers, wanted to put on the leather jackets and the black beret, but they didn't really know the platform. That platform is amazing, and everyone should read it, because among other things, it calls for the end of mass incarceration of African-American citizens. It calls for reparations for slavery. It calls for an end to the systematic police violence directed against Black people. It calls for equal access to education, employment, housing, and so on. All these things, more than 50 years later, we're still struggling to get in this country.
Right.
It's sobering.
Mm-hmm. Where can we find that list?
The 10-point Black Party platform? Well, it's everywhere online. Just, you know, the Black Panther 10-point platform.
Great. Okay, John, can you put that in the chat box? Do you have any other questions or comments or whatever?
I have a follow-up because I didn't quite get the question spoken to that I'd hoped. Just to say that it isn't just about the Republican Party being passionate. There are many independents that are passionate, that the Democratic Party is really not speaking to. Trump is more of an anti-establishment vote, which not is just a right vote, but I have friends who voted for Trump that are clearly not right-wing, but they really didn't see the Democratic Party speaking to many of these values we're talking about. So that Bernie is part of the party, yes, but it has been to a large degree repressed, according to friends who are delegates that worked for Bernie when they went back to the Democratic Convention. So how might we find a party that actually espouses these things we're talking about, not just in a politically correct way, but in a deep way that you're talking about?
Well, first of all, Ken, it's not just about the Democratic Party, of course. Yes, the point we do make within the book is that electoral strategy is important, and that the left has to take it seriously and has to contest for power and for office. And finally, we're seeing that now, fortunately, in a way we didn't see back in the 60s and 70s. And so we do see AOC, we see various members of Congress, Progressive Caucus, and so on, you know, and Bernie, you're right, and Elizabeth Warren even. So that is different, but we can't just have protests through spasm. That's not going to work. That isn't what the far right is doing. They're very organized. They're very armed. It's frightening how armed they are, and they're very serious about taking back power in this country. And to them, that means rounding up people, means killing some people, means putting people in prison. they're very serious about taking charge of this country and doing it, some of them, in violent ways. So I'm not suggesting we have to meet their violence with counter violence. Margaret and I have been very clear about the lessons of the 60s, and Dennis Banks and Russell Means, who were quite militant during the 60s, by the end of their lives, came around and said it has to be done through peaceful means. It's the only way to make deep constructive change in this country. So I believe that, Margaret believes that, but we do have to take this threat to democracy even more seriously. We have to get better organized. We have to develop leadership. We're afraid of leadership. We're afraid of power. Todd Gitlin, who was president of SDS at Tom Hayden's memorial service, told me this, as I quote them in the book, saying that we're ambivalent about power, we on the left. We can't be ambivalent about power. I'm not sure what there comes from, that kind of moral queasiness. We have to be very serious about taking power the way that, Bobby Kennedy and JFK were serious about it. We can't flinch anymore. We have to realize that we're up against it. This country is in the balance and we have to fight for it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Glad to hear you say it. We have a few questions. I don't know that we're going to get to them all because I don't want to keep you on here forever and take all your time. But Gina, you're next.
Hi. So a couple thoughts and a question, because yeah, I heard what you were saying and it made a lot of sense. And I would say it's not only about being scared of power and having leaders, but it's about the left doesn't really understand the electoral process, period. And it's today I heard something that really depressed me, but it reminded me of what I already knew. So we've now had the census. The congressional districts are going to be redrawn. The states, like Texas was sort of used as an example, that are run by Republican state houses, are looking at the congressional districts to carve up the ones that they can to get rid of the Democratic congressmen. The person I heard listening to some commentary NPR was absolutely certain that because of this, the Democrats are going to lose the House. And it's not, but besides, there's always this, the Democrat, the party in power loses in the midterm elections, but this was not just, it was more than that. The party in power are going to lose in the midterm election, but it was about that these Republican state houses are specifically looking at that. Okay, and that is what I mean, the backlash. So they said, okay, these people who protested in the street ended the Vietnam War, but hey, we know how we use the system to really get what we want, so to speak, So I guess, that's my kind of, so when I was listening to this today, I really almost cried, because I was just like, oh my God, it had so much hope. And I heard this and thought, anyway, so I guess what I'm asking David and Margaret, what do we do now? Because that's fundamental, how they carving up the state houses, having that control. A lot of states aren't like California, where we changed how we do redistricting. And so that's what's your thoughts on what I just said?
I mean, I think you're right that it's incredibly sobering, because the Republican Party has just displayed sort of diabolical genius and determination when it comes to gerrymandering and to their advantage. I mean, they've been kind of lethal about it. And I also agree that, and I think many people have pointed this out, that, starting with the Tea Party, they were very effective at not only sort of congressional level politics, but local politics, getting people to run for school board and city council, and thereby training people to run for higher office. And I do think there has been some awakening to the importance of that on the progressive side, and since Trump, because Trump was such a shock to the system, and I think there has been a little bit more awareness that you have to start sometimes at the local level, but run for office in your local area. So there has been a little more progressive training at the state and local level for people running for office, but. Yeah, I mean, I hope that the awakening will yield results in the long run, but I don't think we're in a great position right now.
But
Yeah.
you know what Mother Jones, the famous labor organizer, said many years ago was, "Don't mourn, organize."
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the left tends to dap sometimes after they elect a President Obama or Biden and say, "We got this." Fatigue sets in. I understand fatigue. We all suffer from that political fatigue, you know, giving, marching, contributing, and so on. But the problem is democracy is a day-to-day battle. It's an everyday battle. And if you look at it historically, we quote John Adams, you know, the future second president of the United States. And he wrote a letter back in 1776 from the Congressional Congress in Philadelphia. And he was bemoaning the fact that the revolution had set loose all these different, you know, aspirations from young people and college students who suddenly wanted to be more free, from women, from Indians, from Negroes, as he put it, who were standing up to their masters, God forbid, for the first time. And he said, quote, I hope that the whirlwind of change will be calmed by the serenity, more serene temper at some point. And they've been trying to bottle up that whirlwind of change ever since the American Revolution. And we can't let them do that. Democracy is always at risk. It's always under pressure from forces of power and greed and oligarchy and militarism. That's who has the upper hand always in every society. The people with money, the people with the weapons and so on. The military, whether it's the power elite, you call it that, or the military industrial complex. You know, and so it's our job as the people to keep fighting even harder than they do to defend democracy and advance it.
And another point I think along with that is the mythology that's been created by specifically the right about our history. And it leaves out a whole half of the history, the slavery, the killing off of the native population, and romanticizes these ideals that don't exist in our society, but basically gives all the power to conservative or fascist white men. So I think the mythology that they're operating on the right is something to, if we can educate people about, would be very useful too. I've got two more questions and then I think we will stop it. I'm going to ask you to make the question short. So first Ray and then Ben.
Yeah, thanks, David and Margaret. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about your comment about the police infiltrators, especially David Banks' wife. My goodness, and I can only imagine that is a continual problem for like the Standing Rock people. Thankfully, the pipeline has just been killed, but there are other pipelines, of course, and now we've got this overt fascism playing out in the Republican Party, and shock troops being formed formally, like this First Amendment Praetorians who are wearing black shirts to show their fealty to fascism, and Antifa's on their list. Boy, if they can find them, they'll take them out. So how do we channel our concern about fascism and this kind of deep undermining of the attempt at actual democracy, both on the activist organizing level and worrying about infiltration, the general push for open fascism right now. I just I'm completely stunned by it all and not sure which way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that, what we saw in the last, kind of unleashed and empowered and legitimized by Trump, the kind of open white supremacy, fascist impulses, that people always said, it could not happen here and so on. It's been, bracing, it's been sobering. It's probably helpful to see some of that come out in the open, but you have to, we have to keep denouncing it, calling people on it, exposing it, countering it. But yeah, I mean, I certainly don't have any magic bullet on this one, but I feel like, yeah, it has not, I mean, it has not gone away with Trump, obviously. And it's something we're going to be facing over the next decades, I think, if we want to protect American democracy.
But
So
where,
I wish I had a better answer. I wish I had the answer, but
right. What I'd like to see, and I have these arguments with young people, including my own children sometimes, and we dedicate the book to our 4 children who have a very unique, of course, and generational view of their own. But what I'd like to see in general less of within progressive circles, I understand the roots of it, why it came about, but less of a concern about identity politics and more of a concern about building broader coalitions at this point, building a broader movement that could withstand these concerted assaults on democracy. I think, frankly, following the presidential election, there was a fatigue that set in. And I just got an email from Intercept magazine, acknowledging this. And I'm sure their donations are way down. They're expecting more donations from people now but there's never, electing someone is never the final battle. In fact, getting someone elected begins months, if not years before. We all know this from our organizing experience. And what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, I think, was heroic. And I think that kind of grassroots organizing clearly has to be done state by state, particularly in the states that have become battlegrounds for the heart and soul of America. And we know where they are. We need to build coalitions. We need to get together in a kind of way that Martin Luther King, in his visionary way, was advocating before he died. When he reached out to groups like the Panthers and the farm workers and the American Indian movement and so on, that was very important. And only he had the pulpit at that point to do something like this. But we all have to be Martin Luther King in some way. And we all have to build a commonality now with each other, rather than, turning on each other and outing each other and scapegoating each other. There's so many things that can tear us apart, but there's even bigger things that can pull us together. And one, of course, is the whole issue, and Fred Hampton was trying to organize around this in Chicago before he was assassinated, is the issue of class that brings everyone together, that brings so many of us together. I mean, it's outrageous that the top 25 super billionaires in this country paid no taxes or very little taxes over the last 3 years. It's an outrage. And even some Republicans are now upset about it, which shows you how bad it is.
Yeah.
So that, is the kind of common issue, or common outrage that should be bringing together a mass movement in this country. After January 6th, after the Congress's failure to do anything about January 6th, we should be in the streets, frankly. We should be demanding that Mitch McConnell not hold up legislation that could not only save the Biden presidency, but save our country, save democracy. Essential legislation that this country needs to move into the next century, the century we're in. So look, we can't just let the same problems, plague us that plagued the Obama era. We've learned from that. Joe Biden learned from it. He's trying to be different. We have to go in the streets now and give him the kind of power that he needs, his presidency, so it can become as, successful, and then go beyond that.
I think we need to go out in the streets and get rid of the filibuster, because we're not going to be able to do anything without getting rid of that. And we've got 2 Democratic senators that are holding it up. And we need to really push on those 2 Democratic senators. So Ben will be the last question, and I'm going to ask you to make it short.
All right. Well, I took a break from my walk in Schollenberger Park here. I've been listening to this, and I wanted to thank our guest, the Talbots, for giving us this history of the recent history of the radical movement. And as a veteran of that, I've seen, these permutations over the years. There's civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, Occupy for a brief moment, but there never seems to be able to be a coherent left put together in this country. And I think, to conclude, your observation about, coming to the stakes of the moment is really apropos, because the people who are working to end voting rights for us are far more impassioned about this than the leadership of the Democratic Party, on whom I'm relying as my defense. There seems to be a lack of resolve at that level. I'd like you to address that.
Margaret, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I share your frustration with that. I also, I mean, I guess maybe I err on the side of cockeyed optimism. I feel somewhat energized by the push, the Stacey Abrams and others led exposure of and pushback against the voter repression and the gerrymandering that we've seen, but more of it. What can I say? I mean, and I hope that we can, by just repeatedly exposing it, try to reverse some of the effects. As a journalist, I feel like that's partly what I can do. Is write about this and kind of pound the drum about it. But I share your frustration.
But
Which
again,
we all have.
the lessons I think we need to learn, and certainly you were part of this history, and we need to learn from this history and pass along these lessons to our children and to younger activists. 3 lessons in our book that I want to emphasize before we end today.
Right.
Leadership is important. And even though they assassinate leaders, even though leaders let us down sometimes, even though leaders are unaccountable sometimes and the egos take over, we need good, visionary, courageous leadership to hold the organization together. Number 2, organization. Organize. And solidarity and coalition building between organizations. Those were all important lessons also in our book and from history. And number 3, a culture of resistance. We need, and I've read a lot of, quotes from older Black activists, civil rights activists who say the same thing. To keep going so you don't burn out, and we'll all burn out over time if we don't have this. We need a culture of resistance too. We need music, we need theater, we need film, we need all the things that came out of the 60s. And we all know who they were, people who entertained us, who kept us inspired. We need a culture of resistance again. And that's slowly developing here and there, but we need it to blossom in a way that it blossomed in the 60s. And that'll keep us going year after year. So those are the 3 things I want to emphasize. We need leadership, we need organization and solidarity between organizations, and we need a culture of resistance.
And that last part, which was one of my questions too, was building that culture of resistance with music, with film, with art. And that is something that still needs to come together in our era. It definitely came together in the 60s, but we're still struggling to bring that artistic fusion together that will support the cultural change that we want. So I think that was a really good note to finish on and for us to think about. Any last thoughts from either of you before we close our event today?
That was my big sound off.
Yeah, I love ending it on that.
I think it's a great note to end on too. So I want to thank both of you so much for being with us today. We record everything, as you know. You will get the links tonight. Everyone who's on this call and people who registered who aren't on will get the links tonight, and so will both of you. And I just want to thank you again and hope we can have you in person sometime, all of you, both of you.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate all the great questions and comments and, just getting to see all of you.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.